what is climate change?
Well, the issue of climate change has been around for a long time, actually. And the reason it's becoming increasingly a concern, a threat, is because what we're doing to the atmosphere. We're changing the composition of the atmosphere. And we're doing that by burning primarily fossil fuels. And as we burn those fossil fuels, the waste gases from them go into the atmosphere. We've known for a long time that these gases, we call them greenhouse gases, they affect the climate. They're almost like a blanket around the earth. The more greenhouse gases we have there, the thicker the blanket. And the thicker the blanket, the warmer the atmosphere, the warmer the earth. So as we're continually burning fossil fuels, emitting the waste into the atmosphere, where they can stay for up to 1,000 years, then we're changing the climate. We're making the climate warmer. And that's going to have all sorts of impacts on us, on our societies, on people, with future generations in other countries. And frankly, we're running out of time. So it's really a concern. It's a concern for all of us.
You say we're running out of time. What does that mean?
Well, it's because the changes, we've already seen several changes, and the changes seem to be accelerating, and the changes are going to get greater. The longer we put off tackling this issue, the greater will be those changes, and the more difficult it's going to be to actually do something about it. Because, as I said, those gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time. So we're building up more and more gases in the atmosphere.
And I'm sorry to cut you, but what evidence is there that there is climate change? I'm asking this because there's many people, groups that say there isn't any and this is pretty much made up. What do you say?
That's a very good question. There's a lot of evidence. First of all, we can look at our emissions, the waste that we generate from burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, that's oil, coal, natural gas, those sorts of things. And the emissions are growing. They're growing all the time, slowly, faster and faster. And seemingly without slowing down. The second thing is we can look at the amount of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we've been measuring them very carefully, very accurately, for about 50 years now. And they have been growing up slowly all the time. There's now about 30% more in the atmosphere than there was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That was before we had engines, when we relied on muscle power, animal power, and things like that. So in those years, the atmosphere, the concentrations of these greenhouse gases, the amount of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has increased by at least 30%. So it's quite evident. We're already seeing evidence of the impacts. The temperature, the global average temperature is increasing. The global average temperature now is higher than any of the natural variability of the climate. We've seen globally averaged a rise in temperature of about 0.8 of a degree. That's not the same all over the world. In the polar regions, the north of Canada, for example, it's 3 times as fast as that. And we're seeing effects, which I can talk about later if you like, of what that's doing to the Arctic.
I would like some evidence. However, with evidence, studying so many years, why is there such strong opposition from some groups that these evidence are not enough?
There's all sorts of arguments, I think. I mean, it's difficult to get into their heads. But part of the reason, I think, is denial. They don't really want to accept that this is an issue. In part, they don't want to accept it because they realize that tackling climate change is going to mean changing our lifestyles. And they don't want to have to accept that. There are deep ideological reasons for saying no. I mean, religious reasons in some cases. There are those who say, we human beings, we're just too small, insignificant to change the climate that God's created for this planet Earth. There are business interests. There are, particularly from the fossil fuel companies, businesses, who are worried that, well, perhaps if they start tackling climate change seriously, there's not going to be such a market for the fossil fuels, for the oil and gas and the coal and everything else. So there are a lot of reasons for it.
And those who are in the other side of the argument, what groups are there? For example, what is the IPCC?
Okay. The number of people who actually deeply deny climate change is quite small. The scientific community has a very clear consensus that this is a real issue, that climate change is happening now, and it's quite real. Where you find most people is in between those. People who are confused, who are not quite sure what to believe because they've heard so many stories on one side or the other. The scientific communities brought together through this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what we call the IPCC. And it represents most of the climate science community globally in the world. And there are scientists in there from where I come from Canada, from many other countries in the industrialized world. There are scientists from Peru. A good colleague of mine that was with me on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is Peruvian. His name is Eduardo Calvo. He lives here in Lima. So there's a lot of scientists from around the world, many different disciplines. And their job is set up by the United Nations to provide governments with the most authoritative assessment of the state of knowledge of climate change. And they produce reports every 5 or 7 years. And the latest reports really draw a line under the science of climate change. They say that climate change, global warming as so many people refer to it, is now real. It's unequivocal. In other words, you really can't argue with the science anymore.
But are they more of a fact-finding group, or what authority do they have?
They have the authority granted to them by the United Nations and by the governments of the United Nations. They have the authority because they are recognized scientists. The IPCC doesn't do science, it assesses the science. But this is science that are done by these international experts. In order to contribute to the IPCC, governments look at the scientists and look at their resumes, their curricula vitae, and make sure that they are indeed experts, and quite importantly, that they have no vested interests, that they are assessing the science as objectively as possible.
Does each nation choose what to do with that information, or how do
Yes.
each country do with it?
The important thing about the IPCC is it's not policy prescriptive, it's policy relevant. Mm-hmm. So it provides that assessment of the science. And then governments, together and individually, decide how to interpret that and how to translate that into policies, both national policies, regional policies, and global policies.
As a person, a human being, someone living here, why should we care about climate change? What's the ultimate consequence? But as well, because you said so many years they've been warning us about this cataclysmic events that are supposed to happen. But so far we haven't really seen as drastic a result as the warnings has given us. So why should people care? Why should people worry, even though you have the fact the worst case scenario still has not happened at the time point they've warned us about?
Climate change is a very difficult issue because its effects are sometimes not seen, and it's what it builds up over time. Fortunately, we can look into the future and we can look at what the impacts might be in the future. We have some information today on the impacts. I said, particularly in the Arctic. Until recently, the Arctic was ice covered almost all year round. That's no longer the case. The sea ice in the Arctic is melting, and it's melting faster than any scientist ever predicted it would melt. It could very well be that within 10, 20 years, in the summer, there will be no more sea ice covering the Arctic.
What would that mean?
What does that mean? That means several things. It means that the Inuit, the indigenous people that live there, are going to have very different lifestyles. They used to rely on the sea ice to go hunting, to go traveling. That sea ice is not reliable anymore, and we've already seen accidents, people falling through the ice. They can't get to their hunting grounds anymore. So it's having really serious impacts on the indigenous people in the Arctic.
What about the world? How would this impact the rest of the world, the continents, the sea shorelines?
You're going to see, amongst other impacts, sea level rising. Slowly, but surely. And there are large parts of the world where populations are close to the sea level already, particularly in a lot of the developing world. We have mega cities right by the coast, and those are already threatened by sea level rise. And there's an inertia in the system that we know the sea level is going to continue to rise. And it's going to affect places like New York, it's going to affect places in Bangladesh, coastal cities in Latin America. And in addition to the sea level rise, you're going to see increases in storms.
Like currently in North America, those mega hurricanes, are they related to this? Is there any correlation?
They're exactly what we expect with climate change, that climate change is going to bring increases in the severity and the frequency of these extreme events. So you're going to get these storms coming in. For example, the hurricanes that affect the coast of Florida. Miami is right at sea level, and you're going to get more and stronger hurricanes. They're going to have damaging effects on the people who live there, on the infrastructure that's there, and it's going to threaten ways of life.
And what about seasons and temperatures, maximum, minimum?
You basically, and this is one of the good news, is you're going to see longer growing seasons, particularly in the temperate regions where I live in Canada, that spring will come earlier and the autumn will come later. So that period in between, you'll have a longer growing season. But climate change is not just an increase of temperature. It also means changes in precipitation, in rainfall. And the rainfall is going to be less reliable. The runoff from the rivers is going to be less reliable. And so farmers are going to find that the water they need, particularly for growing those crops, is going to be less reliable. Those are some of the really important impacts. And you're likely to see that here in Peru. You rely on water coming out of the Andes. A lot of that water was tied up for a long time in the glaciers. Those glaciers are melting. You've lost some glaciers already. And you're not going to be able to rely on those glaciers for the water in the summer to feed the crops that you grow, the cash crops that you grow along by the coast here.
How else will this negative, or better worded, human climate change affect, well, we're in Peru, so we're concerned about how would all this affect us other than the water that you already mentioned? What changes are we to expect and how to avoid them?
Water is the big issue, and particularly water world that's coming out of the mountains, the Andes here in Peru. you don't have the snowpack building up in the winter as you used to, because a lot of that precipitation is going to fall as rain and not as snow. And you rely on the snow in the winter as it builds up to lock up the water that you'll rely on in the summer. So it's going to have quite serious impacts providing drinking water for the 8 million people that live in Lima, for the water for the irrigation of those cash crops that you grow along the coastline here. It's going to affect the ocean currents. I mean, you know very well in Peru the effects of El Nino and La Nina.
We live off of the currents.
That's right, because of the currents bring the nutrients that you rely on for the fish, and the fish produce the other fish, and etc., etc. And we've known this for a long time. This is where the whole El Nino was first seen.
Without these currents, you don't have any ceviche.
And without these currents, you're not going to have a lot of the fish that you rely on. And I mean, so fortunately, I mean, we've got to understand El Nino fairly well. El Nino is a climate variation, but it's one that occurs every 3, 5, 7 years. We're starting to understand it because of how the ocean currents change on that sort of a time scale. Climate change is not on that time scale. Climate change is something which is in a much grander time scale. It's possible that with the warming of the ocean that we see, that we might in fact see some permanent changes in some of those currents. The likelihood of that is pretty small in the short, medium term, but you never know. The climate may have surprises for us.
How will climate change affect nations? But I want to focus more on how will it affect the individual.
Well, it's going to affect where it depends on who they are, where they live, how rich they are, what they do for a living. If you're an Inuit, as I said, living in the north of Canada, you're going to be affected because the sea ice is disappearing, and the permafrost, the frozen land on which they build their infrastructure, their roads, their airports, their houses, that's melting. So you'll see some changes if you live there. If you live in the tropical areas, you're going to see changes in rainfall, in precipitation. In temperate areas like where I live, you'll see changes in agriculture. Mm-hmm. Some crops you're not going to be able to grow anymore. You're going to see changes in precipitation patterns. You're going to see more intense rainstorms that are going to overwhelm the infrastructure that we have of getting rid of those. So we're going to see more floods. You're going to see particularly, stronger hurricanes, not necessarily more of them, but sometimes stronger hurricanes. They're going to affect the infrastructure.
What about radiation trappings? Right? Will that radiation, the temperature coming in, will it affect health-wise? How will we affect? Will there be more cancer?
There are two really big concerns, health concerns. Mm-hmm. The first is malnutrition. The fact is, in a lot of parts of the world where people are quite poor, where their food is not so secure, climate change is going to make that food supply even more precarious. And you're going to have malnutrition. The other problem is, again, these extreme events, heat waves that are going to affect where I live in the temperate regions. And we've already seen recently in the last decade or so very severe heat waves. One that occurred in Europe in 2003 that gave rise to 40 to 50,000 additional deaths. In 2010, we saw a very severe heat wave in Russia that gave rise to, again, another 40 or 50,000 additional deaths. So we have to worry, particularly for older people, particularly for people whose health is not strong, about these increases in severe heat waves in our part of the world.
Okay, let's start guiding this to a more positive note. and get out of the apocalypse. And what can countries, nation, organization, the individual do to avoid the worst case scenario?
Okay. You've used two words, apocalypse and cataclysmic. I never use those alarmist words because it tends to turn people off. There are things that we can do. Two sorts of things. The first is reduce our emissions of these greenhouse gases, these waste gases from our burning of fossil fuels. What do I mean by reducing that? First of all, is we can use less energy, which means turning off lights when we don't need them. We can use that energy more efficiently. What does that mean? It means driving smaller cars. We can change to carbon fuels which are not fossil fuels, renewable energy fuels, fuels which have got lower emissions of greenhouse gases. What do I mean by that? Solar power, using solar panels on our roofs, produce electricity to produce warm water. Using wind energy, so we can use more of those non-carbon fuels. All of that is possible. All of that is going to change our lifestyles, but all of that is going to give rise to new industries and new opportunities. And it could be very positive.
You're correlating that what we need right now is to step on inform people with the evidence you already gathered. And step two, we need more technical people, science people. We need more prepared people. So an investment in education is also a priority right now.
That's right. No, I think you've got it quite accurately. First, we have to make people aware that we have a threat. And I talk about a threat of climate change because we're not sure where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and who it's going to affect. But we know there's a threat. So awareness is number one thing. But we've been generating awareness for a long time. I think we've got to look at it in terms of what can people do about it, and not in alarmist terms, but in positive terms, of how it will change their lifestyles for the better, how it will generate new businesses, new industries, how it will change our development in positive ways. And so we need those technologies. There's not going to be one silver bullet. There are going to be lots of different technologies. But we have to develop them, we have to make them affordable, we have to make them available.
Before it's too late.
Before it's too late.
We
are running out of time.
I agree. Would you like to add any final commentary and additional information?
Well, yes, actually. I mean, just a few observations, spending now only 2 days walking around Lima. I mean, I've seen some things which I found very encouraging. You're putting in a mass transit system. You're going to try and get people out of their cars. Personal transportation is a huge contribution to the problem. So I think that's very positive. I've looked around at the lighting that you see in houses, and I see a lot more of these energy efficient light bulbs being put in. I looked at the traffic lights that you've got, and the traffic lights are now powered with light emitting diodes, using much, much less electricity. So I see these things that you're already doing in Lima here, which are really helping to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases from energy use, from the use of fossil fuels, from the old technologies. You're already making very positive steps. It's very encouraging.
That's very nice to know. Now, as a final favor, would you like to give our audience a 1-minute message that encompasses a positive message? Like can we do, what we're doing, what are you doing, what is the world doing, and the good things that we see from it?
Yes, let me try. As I said, climate change is not a new issue. Climate change has been around as a threat for a long time. But at the beginning, it was framed as an environmental issue. And it truly is an environmental issue. But it's also a development issue. And what do I mean by that? First of all, that climate change is going to affect our current development plans. our current development plans were based on yesterday's climate. And yesterday's climate is not going to be a good guide for the climate of the future. So climate change is going to affect our development plans. We're going to have development plans which take into account the new climate. The other way around is our development plans, if carefully engineered, can help to tackle the climate change issue. Let me just give you an example. If our development plans build more energy efficient cities, smaller cities, more compact cities, we're going to not only make those cities more sustainable, pleasanter, we're going to affect the climate change issue. We're going to reduce some of the pressures. So you've got to look at climate change as a development issue. It's a very positive message, I think, that we're going to have to, if we're clever, put in place policies for sustainable development that will also at the same time help to tackle the climate change issue.
Well, Dr. Stone, thank you very much for your time, and I hope everybody puts a little bit of their part to help the world.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a privilege to be able to be on there.
Thank you.